Good morning everybody and welcome back to the Scafidi Travels YouTube channel. Today we have a rather exciting video for you. It's another dealing with Tunisian bureaucracy video. Today we're going to be talking about how to export your cat from Tunisia. So I've got hundreds of questions about this over the past few months on social media. Basically, it's turned into a bit of a joke that if you move to Tunisia, after a while you're going to end up adopting a Tunisian street cat. And then at the end of your time in Tunisia, you're faced with the kind of dilemma, how do I take the cat with me? So today we're going to talk you through how to export your Tunisian street cat. The focus is going to be on taking it to the UK, because that's exactly what I did, so from Tunisia to the UK. But to be honest, the process is very, very similar, whether you're taking your cat to the UK, anywhere in the EU, the US, Canada. So I'll talk UK generally throughout the video, and then at the end we'll have a little discussion as to how things are slightly different depending on which country your cat's going to end up in. As many of you will know, I have a Tunisian street cat, or Catoussa, called Moon. I adopted her in March 2020 during the Confinement Général, so the lockdown that we had here in Tunisia. She was born on the mean streets of Lacda in Tunis. She's actually born underneath my 4x4 in an underground car park. And she basically lived with me for 2 and a bit years until I left Tunisia in September 2022, and that's when I went through this whole process and took her to the UK. So she is now living happily as a British Catoussa with my mother in the south of England, and as you can see from some of these videos and pictures, she's having a great old time. But yeah, getting her to the UK was a complicated process, so hopefully this video will help any of you out there struggling and make it a little bit easier if you'd like to take your street cat with you when you leave. In terms of the structure of the video, what we're going to do is I'm going to talk you through firstly the time frames and costs, so you've got a very clear idea of what you're committing to if you choose to do this. Next section, very quick, will just be outsourcing. So if you kind of look at this video and think I can't be bothered to go through all this, it's too much hassle, then we've got some information for some people who can just do it all for you if you're willing to pay. Then we'll talk about routes, so what's the best way of doing it? So do you want to fly your cat into the UK? Do you want to bring your cat in on a boat? That kind of thing. We'll talk a little bit then about the differences between importing your cat to the UK versus the EU versus the USA, that sort of thing, and then we'll finish up with some kind of final thoughts, have a conclusion there. And yeah, if you want to jump straight ahead, then you can kind of click through on the chapters and just jump to the bit that you think is going to be most useful. Right, let's talk timeframes and costs now. So I'll start with costs. I think it's probably going to cost you about 300-ish euros to get your cat ready to be imported into the UK. It's pretty similar, actually it's exactly the same for the EU, to be honest. Most of those costs are going to be associated with veterinary bills. So it's going to be things like getting the cat microchipped, getting all the vaccinations, and also the most expensive single item is going to be getting blood work done, which has to be sent off to the EU and then getting it back to show that your cat has actually got the rabies antibodies. Now, in terms of time frames, that's going to be a little bit different depending on whether you're trying to import your cat into the EU or whether you're importing your cat into the UK. Now, assuming your kitten is 1 day old, let's say it's just been born, you're going to need 7 months before you can bring that cat into the UK. And there's a few reasons for that, but there are some kind of built-in deliberate delays from the UK government, meaning that you need to wait between certain processes. If you're going to import it into the EU, probably about 4 months from birth, I would say. Now, the reasons for this kind of long time frame in both cases is that most countries are going to want the cat to be vaccinated in order to allow it in. Kittens can't be vaccinated till they're at least 12 weeks old, so 3 months old, so you're going to need to wait for that. And then even after they're vaccinated, there's more waiting to be done because you need to do a blood test to show that they are vaccinated against rabies, so they need to have the rabies antibodies detected in their bloodstream, and that whole process takes anything from 1 month to 3 months, depending on whether you're doing it to UK specifications or EU specifications. So yeah, this is a pretty long process, so you need to get organised and make sure you start it well before you're trying to take your cat out of Tunisia. If you're looking to outsource all of this, then there are kind of 2 aspects to that. Firstly, there's finding a veterinary professional in Tunisia who's experienced with this process and can handle all the paperwork for you. And secondly, there's finding a fixer who can actually help you deal with the Tunisian bureaucracy. So I'll give you a recommendation for both of those. So we'll start with the veterinarian. So the vet that I used to do this whole process was Dr. Aya Handous, and she works at Clinique Vétérinaire Marsasada. That's in La Masa. I'll put all of the details, but they've got a pretty active Facebook page, and also she's very responsive on WhatsApp. Speaks English as well, and she's done this for countless people to both the EU and the UK and further afield. So yeah, if you want to get in touch with her, she will know exactly what's going on and be able to sort you out. On the logistics side, as always, I'm going to recommend Omar over at Tunisia Expat Assistance. Omar is excellent, and yeah, he helped me with this process, so he knows exactly how it works, and he's helped lots of other people with the process as well. So he also has a very active Facebook page, also very responsive on WhatsApp, and also speaks excellent English. So if you want to get in touch with him, he'll be able to give you a quotation for getting your cat with all the paperwork out of the country safely. Right, step one in this rather complicated process is to find yourself a decent vet who knows what they're doing. So I've already recommended a vet for you. There are loads of vets in Tunisia who know how this works, but just be sure when you are speaking to a vet that they have done this before, otherwise you might end up with the wrong paperwork. Right, step two is to make sure that your cat is at least 12 weeks old before you start the rest of this process. I mean, generally speaking it will be, because it should really be with its mother before it's got older than 3 months, but yeah. Just make sure you don't try and do this process with a teeny tiny cat, because the vet's not going to be able to vaccinate the cat. Okay, so once it's 12 weeks old, or at least, you can then take it to the vet and get it microchipped. This is very, very important. So the microchip has to go in before any of the vaccinations. Okay, so you need to get it microchipped, so find a vet who's actually able to do that. That shouldn't cost too much, and to be specific, the microchip, to get into the UK at least, it needs to be scannable, and that means it needs to meet certain ISO standards. So it needs to meet ISO 11784 and 11785 standards. So if you're not sure, ask the vet to see the package for the microchip. Make sure it does meet those standards, or it won't be acceptable. Right, next step is to get your cat vaccinated, and remember, vaccines have to go in after the microchip. Now, the only vaccine required to take your cat into the UK and to most of the rest of the world is the rabies vaccine. Doesn't necessarily mean that's the only vaccine you should give your cat. Most vets are also going to recommend that you give them the combination vaccine. I think the acronym is FVRCP, so that's against feline viral rhinotracheitis, if that's correct. Feline distemper and calcivirus. So these are all dangerous transmissible diseases that cats can get, and sadly a lot of cats do get on the streets in Tunisia. I'd also recommend that you get your cat dewormed, but speak to your vet about exactly what vaccinations they think it's going to need. And a last point, just because the foreign authorities only want a rabies vaccine, that doesn't mean that's all the Tunisian authorities are going to want. So I think it's best to get all the vaccinations, because you're also going to need permits from the Tunisian authorities. They're going to want to see that. And one final point there is that the vaccinations need to be less than a year old in order for the Tunisian authorities to give you an export permit. So I said the time frame for this whole process is about 4 months, but you can't just do it 3 or 4 years before you want to actually take the cat out of the country. It needs to be within that 365-day window. Otherwise, the Tunisian authorities aren't going to give you that export permit. So there are your kind of two ends in terms of when you should be doing this. Your next step is very simple, and it is to wait 30 days. The reason you are waiting for 30 days is because you're waiting for rabies antibodies to build up in your cat's bloodstream so they can be detected in a blood test. Now, there's no way of speeding this up. This is a requirement for the EU labs. This is a requirement for any country that you're going to want to take the cat into. So this is why you've got to get organised and start this process well before you actually want to take the cat out of the country. Next step is to take your cat to the vet and to get a blood sample. The vet is then going to send that off to an EU certified lab, and there's only a few of these, so it has to be one of the EU certified labs. Your vet will know what that means. So they're going to send the blood off, it's going to be tested for rabies antibodies, and it's going to come back with a certificate saying that your cat either has or hasn't got the antibodies. So it's kind of evidence that your cat has been vaccinated against rabies. Now, I've heard rumours recently that there is now an EU certified lab in Tunis itself, I think at the Institut Pasteur maybe, but I'm not so sure about that. I think you'd have to do some asking around. That would be great, because obviously it doesn't involve the cost of sending blood work all the way to the EU and back, and presumably be a bit quicker. But my understanding, based on exporting my cat in September 2022, is the blood has to go into the EU. And my cat's blood actually went to a French lab, I believe it was, and that took a few weeks to come back with the results. So when you're bringing your cat into the UK, unfortunately, if you're coming from Tunisia, Tunisia counts as an unlisted country on UK Customs website, and that means bringing the cat in is slightly more complicated than it would be if you're bringing it in from the EU or somewhere else. So let's have a look. If we read through the list on the UK government website of the kind of steps required to bring a cat in from a non-listed country, firstly, they're going to want to have a blood sample taken at least 30 days after the rabies vaccination. So we've already talked about that and said how you've got to leave that delay. And then they need a result back from an EU-approved lab showing that the cat has rabies antibodies. But the next bit is the frustrating bit, and that's specific to the UK. So they say you must wait 3 months from the date the blood sample was taken before you travel. So yeah, there's just a whole other 3-month delay built in there after you've sent the blood work off to the EU. I mean, in reality, I don't think anybody checked that when I arrived in the UK, but it's certainly not worth the risk, I don't think, because I'm assuming if you try and come into the UK and your cat doesn't have the correct paperwork with the correct dates on it, then your cat might end up in quarantine, or you might just be rejected entry altogether, which could be a huge problem. So yeah, make sure you go to that website and check those timelines very carefully before you take your cat into the UK. Once you have the rabies antibody certificate back from the EU lab, your next step is to get an export permit for your cat. And you're going to have to go down to the Ministry of Agriculture in Tunis in order to do this. So your vet's going to need to draw up a few other bits of paperwork for you, essentially explaining what it is that you're doing and kind of a certificate of health saying your cat's healthy. And you're going to take that with your rabies antibody certificate down to the Ministry of Agriculture, and they are going to inspect the cat and give you an export permit. Now, during the inspection, all they're really going to do is beep the microchip to make sure that the number in the microchip matches the number written on the rabies antibody certificate and the certificate of health, and then just kind of have a look at the cat, make sure it actually looks, well, make sure it's a cat firstly, and also make sure it's looking healthy and ready to be exported. I mean, that process is almost free. I think it's like maybe 5 or 10 dinars for them to give you the stamp, and then you get a little letter from the Ministry of Agriculture saying this cat's good to go. One thing you need to remember is that whole process needs to happen the same week that you are leaving the country with the cat. So you already need to have arrangements in place for taking the cat out of the country, either on the ferry or on the plane. And I think you might need to explain to them the date that you're taking the cat out of the country and how you're taking the cat out of the country. So do remember that. The final step's very simple. You just need to turn up at wherever you're leaving the country, show customs the paperwork, and they will stamp you and the cat out of the country. So presumably it's going to be Tunis Carthage International Airport for most viewers, but it might also be the port if you're going out on a ferry. Yeah, so one last thing to remember is the paperwork requirements for getting out of the country, out of Tunisia, are one thing. The paperwork requirements for getting your cat into wherever it's going to, whether that's the UK, the EU, the USA, are going to be slightly different. So it's important that you check out that section of this video to be clear what else you require, because customs in Tunisia are only really going to want to see the export permit from the Ministry of Agriculture. Everything else isn't really their problem. That's more a concern for the EU, UK, whatever authorities. So yeah, so far I've just taught you through everything required to get it out. Now we're going to talk later in the video about what's required to get it into the country that you're taking it to. Let's talk a little bit about routes, so how to take your cat from Tunisia to the UK. So my route that I took, or we took, me and Moon, in September 2022 was kind of complicated. So we flew with Air France from Tunis to Paris. We then rented a car. We drove from Paris to Dieppe on the coast. We then got on a ferry from Dieppe to Newhaven in the UK, and then we drove from Newhaven to Moon's final destination in England. Now, there are a few reasons why we did that as opposed to just flying to the UK directly from Tunisia. The main reason being you can't fly directly from Tunisia to the UK with a cat. So you can't just show up with a cat at any port of entry in the UK. You need to come in on an approved route. And there's actually a website that gives you a list of approved routes entering with animals from abroad. I'll flash that up on the screen and there'll be a link in the description below. But basically there are no approved routes for flying your cat or dog into the UK directly from Tunisia, which means you have to take a non-direct route. So I suppose you could fly from Tunis to Paris and then Paris to the UK, to London, for example. But the main reason that we avoided that is, firstly, I didn't want to have Moon transiting through Charles de Gaulle, because that sounds like a complete nightmare. But also, if you land with a cat at a UK airport, there's a risk that the cat ends up getting processed by customs for hours and hours and hours. And at Heathrow in particular, I've heard that's a bit of a problem at the moment. So if you fly your cat in or your dog in, it can't come as hand luggage. It has to come as check luggage, which also doesn't sound like much fun for the animal. And it'll end up probably in Heathrow Animal Reception Centre, if that's where you fly into from Charles de Gaulle. And then who knows how long you're going to be waiting around while the animal is getting inspected. You know, it could be 6 hours, could be 8 hours. It just doesn't sound like much fun for you or for the cat. So I opted to avoid that option. Now, the reason we took the ferry is very simple, and that's because I knew that the customs inspections at the other end are very, very quick. So I've got many friends who've taken the ferry, and they all say that that's the best way of doing things. Yeah, at New Haven, when the cat arrived, literally it was just like a glance at the paperwork, a glance at the cat, and then we were gone. And she was in the car with me, and then I drove off. So, you know, that was the quickest, simplest way of getting Moon into the country without being separated from the cat and having to wait around for ages. So, as I said, Moon and I flew Air France. As long as your cat and the carrier that it's in weigh less than 8 kilos, you can take your cat on as hand luggage, and that's exactly what we did. So Moon was actually sat next to me for the entire flight, making so much noise, it was very embarrassing. But yeah, it costs 45 euros, and all you got to do is phone up the Air France help centre, and they'll get the cat booked on, basically, which is very reasonable, I think, having spoken to people who've shipped cats and dogs around as hold luggage, and that ends up costing a lot more. So yeah, 45 euros and one phone call, and you've got your cat booked onto the flight. There are pet stores all over Tunis that will sell kind of soft shell animal holders that are suitable for taking a cat onto a plane. Let me flash up a link to All for Pets Le Sucre, which is exactly where I bought the cat holder. If you want to go down there, they've got loads of options. Right, let's talk a bit about the specific paperwork requirements for bringing your cat into the UK versus the EU versus somewhere else like the USA. So we'll start with the EU, and the EU is pretty simple actually. All you need is an EU animal health certificate to get your cat into the EU. So once you land at Charles de Gaulle or whatever, that's the one bit of paper that you're going to need to show people. There's essentially all it is a letter from your vet in a fixed format, outlining that your animal is healthy and giving details of the rabies antibodies test, which will also be attached to the health certificate. So often people get a little bit confused and they think, oh, should my cat have an EU pet passport? Well, if it's coming from a non-EU country, then no, because they can't issue those. So maybe a customs officer might say, where's the pet passport? And they're going to expect like a kind of blue looking passport document for your cat. You're not going to have one of those, but don't worry, that's not a problem. It's just a letter, EU animal health certificate. And again, this is why it's important to find a vet who's done this before, because then they're going to know the exact format and what they need to write on that letter in order to satisfy the importation requirements when the cat's coming into the EU. And the important thing is the certificate needs to be issued by a vet in the country of departure not more than 10 days before your pet arrives in the EU. And also, that certificate's then going to be valid for about 4 months. So again, you can't really sit on this and then do it a year after you've got all the paperwork. Attached to your EU animal health certificate, you're also going to need to have a written declaration saying that you're importing the animal for non-commercial reasons. So obviously, it's your pet, so that's non-commercial, but they're just wanting to make sure that you're not bringing in animals constantly and selling them, because then there's a whole different process involved if it's commercial. Right, I'll start with the caveat of saying I've never done this, but it seems like importing a cat into the USA is actually a little bit simpler than the UK or the EU. So on the let's have a look. On the US Customs and Border Protection website, again, link below, it says that as a general rule, there are no restrictions on bringing domestic cats into the USA. A general certificate of health is not required by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, which sounds a little bit mad, but apparently that's the rule. So they're saying a rabies certificate is not required for entry into the USA, but pet cats are subject to inspection at port of entry, and they might be denied entry to the USA if there's evidence of an infectious disease that could be transmitted. And if the cat appears to be ill or isn't in good health, there'll be a further examination. So yeah, sounds like you're all right on the USA front if you want to fly your cat over to the USA. Right, last one then, and that's Canada. If we go to the Canadian government's website, we can see that their requirements are pretty simple. You just need a valid rabies vaccination certificate, and they specifically say on this website that an EU pet passport is an acceptable alternative as long as it lists the information they're looking for. So yeah, pretty straightforward for Canada. Okay, a few final thoughts on this entire process. So as with some of my other videos, like how to get a carte de séjour or how to get a drone permit, you'll see this is kind of a bit of a bureaucratic process. You know, part of the bureaucracy is on the Tunisian side, but then a lot of the bureaucracy is also on the EU/UK/Canadian side. Hopefully this video makes it a little bit easier for you to meet the requirements to export your cat. Don't be put off. I mean, it is doable. I've done it. I've got a lot of friends who've done it. I haven't heard of too many problems with the process. I know of a lot of very happy Tunisian street cats who are now living abroad. I think it's very sad, the situation that a lot of street animals find themselves in Tunisia. There's a lot of stray cats, stray dogs, so you know, anything we can do to try and make that situation better is great. So if you can adopt an animal, please do. If you'd like to do a little bit more, then there's a couple of organisations doing great work in Tunisia helping the animals that perhaps you'd like to speak to. One of my favourite organisations working in Tunisia is called Mission Portable Animal Rescue. They've been there since 2010, and essentially over the last 12 years they've helped over 1,500 street animals be adopted and then moved abroad. So they really are experts in this process. So yeah, if you'd like to support them, please have a look at their Facebook page. They're very active on Facebook. And if you see an animal in distress on the streets and you're not able to do anything about it, please get in touch and one of their volunteers should be able to come out and help you out there. If anyone knows of any other good animal charities working in Tunisia, please mention them in the comments below and I'll take a look. I'd be really interested to hear about any other good work that's going on over there. I hope you all found that useful and it helps to get some Tunisian animals rehomed. If you would like some ridiculous Instagram story updates on Moon's new life in the UK, then please follow me along on my Instagram, which is just @OscarScafidi. Bye.